Hello and welcome to The Primary Solution, a conversation with Nick Troiano. I'm Manal Haddad, Senior Communications Manager for Voting Rights and Redistricting at Campaign Legal Center. Thank you for joining us. CLC is a national, nonpartisan organization working to advance democracy through law at the federal, state, and local levels. We fight for every American's right to participate in the democratic process, and we believe our democracy should be transparent, accountable, and inclusive. The voices of voters are what matters most in our democracy. Ensuring elected officials truly reflect the views of those they represent requires progress on a number of issues, including strengthening the freedom to vote, campaign finance reform, instituting fair voting maps across the country, and making sure all voters can participate in the electoral process. Nick Troiano's book focuses on the last of these issues, explaining how the dominance of partisan primaries in the US limits our representative democracy. Voter turnout in primary elections is typically a fraction of what we see during general elections. Partisan primaries exclude large numbers of voters from the process, meaning a small group of politically motivated voters can have an outsized influence. This often elevates candidates to the general election who appeal to the partisan extremes of the major parties. The result is elected officials who are beholden to a minority of their voters rather than a majority. Changing the primary system to allow more voters to participate and allow for a broader spectrum of candidates does not require a constitutional amendment or an act of Congress. In fact, states like Alaska and California have already taken steps to limit partisan dominance of political primaries. Moderating today's discussion is Paul Smith, Senior Vice President at Campaign Legal Center. Paul is perhaps best known as a highly regarded U.S. Supreme Court litigator. He's argued before the justices 21 times, securing numerous victories, including important cases advancing civil liberties. He's also represented clients before the High Court on issues of critical importance to our democracy, like voter ID and partisan gerrymandering. At CLC, Paul works directly with our team of litigators to protect and improve our democracy through innovative litigation strategies. He also teaches at Georgetown Law. Paul, take it away.
Thanks, Manal. And before we start our discussion, let me go over a few housekeeping items for everyone. During the conversation, please use the comments section on LinkedIn or YouTube to submit your questions for our speaker. At the end of my questions, we'll start a Q&A section, and we hope to get to your question and everyone's questions, but in the interest of time, we may not be able to do that. If we're not able to answer your question today and you're a member of the press, please email your questions to media@campaignlegal.org. And if you're a member of the public and we didn't get to your question, feel free to email us at info@campaignlegal.org. Now I'd like to take a minute to introduce Nick Troiano, a civic entrepreneur based in Denver, Colorado, and the executive director of Unite America, a nonpartisan philanthropic organization that seeks to foster a more functional and representative government. CLC is, of course, very proud to partner with Unite America. Nick's been a leader in the political reform movement for over a decade, beginning as a founding staff member of Americans Elect in 2010. Nick ran for Congress in Pennsylvania's 10th district in 2014 and drew national attention as both the youngest candidate that cycle and the most competitive independent U.S. House candidate in nearly 2 decades. He subsequently worked for change.org to launch a mobile application to help voters cast informed ballots. And now, of course, he's with Unite America. Thanks very much to Nick for joining us to discuss his important book, The Primary Solution, Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes. And with that intro, let's jump in. Nick, tell me, basic essence here, your core theme is abolishing partisan primaries in American elections as the number one objective. Can you tell us how you landed on that as the most important thing to reform in the American democratic system?
Absolutely. Well, I just want to thank you, Paul, for hosting this conversation and the Campaign Legal Center. We very much admire the great work that you do in improving and protecting our democracy. And United America is really glad for this partnership. And I appreciate everyone who's tuning in for this conversation today. I wrote the Primary Solution book because I have developed a conviction that partisan primaries are the biggest solvable problem in our democracy today. It's not to say that they're the only problem. or the only problem worth working on. But for me and for United America, it's the problem that we're prioritizing because we believe that if we were to solve it, and it is solvable, that it would make a really big difference in helping to foster a more representative and functional government, and that the extent to which we solve the primary problem can pave the way for other reforms that are also necessary. And so it's really for those two reasons that the book argues for prioritizing solving a problem that right now I think many Americans are, take for granted that it even exists. And so I wrote the book to help raise awareness about that, and more importantly, advocate for very practical solutions that can be enacted at the state level across the country.
Right. What you mean by solvable ultimately is it doesn't require a constitutional amendment. It doesn't require an act of Congress in a divided Congress. Just state by state, we just have to pass these new arrangements. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So the solutions are very viable, and the problem staring at us in the face, which is that not only do primaries disenfranchise millions of voters in our country based on their party identification alone, but it creates a incentive structure for most of our leaders to only pander to the extreme base of their party in order to get through their next primary, rather than do what we elected them to do, which is to work together and solve problems, because they fear that if they do so, risk working across the aisle, that it risks them getting primaried in their next election. Primary has gone from being a noun to becoming a verb, and that has really distorted representation in our government and our government's ability to solve every other problem that we care about.
Right. You have some really remarkable statistics in the book that sort of dramatize this particular problem. For the one that I recall most was the idea that about 8% of the electorate in this country elects about 83% of the members of the House of Representatives. Can you explain how that happens and what that means?
When we think about voter turnout, we're happy if we see a majority, maybe over 60% if we're lucky, of Americans turn out in a general election. But the problem of focusing on general election turnout is the fact that most of those elections sadly don't matter in determining election outcomes. Because the vast majority of legislative districts at the federal and state level are so uncompetitive, because those districts are lopsided for either party, the real election, the elections in which people's ballots really matter, is in the primary, when the majority party decides who its standard bearer is. And so that's the first problem, is that primaries are the only election of consequence in most elections. The second problem is that turnout in those primaries, because they happen earlier in the year and get less attention, is rather low, about half the rate of the general election turnout. And the third problem is it's really only that dominant party's primary that matters, not even all the voters who turn out, but only the voters who turn out, say, for the Democratic primary in a blue district or a Republican primary in a red district. And a lot of voters are prohibited from participating in those elections based on their party affiliation. In 15 states, if you're an independent like I am, you don't have a right to participate in the party's primaries. And so at the end of the day, what that means is that 83% of our congressional seats are decided in primaries, and only 8% of Americans cast ballots in those primaries in the last election that determine the outcome. You have 8% of Americans deciding 83% of our elections. And to me, that explains why on issue after issue, you can have a majority of Americans support a particular policy, but Congress doesn't act because Congress doesn't represent a majority of us.
That problem seems very clear. Maybe for the listeners who haven't read the book yet, just give us a summary of what you would do to fix it. You wouldn't have to get rid of primaries. You just have very different kind of primaries, right?
Yeah, that's right. We would, the solution I advocate for is getting rid of partisan primaries, which means primaries that are the sole purpose of which is simply to nominate a candidate for either political party. I think parties are private organizations and they should have their own processes to recruit, support, or endorse candidates. The purpose of a taxpayer-funded and government-run primary, in my view, is simple. It's just to winnow a potentially large field of candidates down to just a handful for the general election. So if you have 10 candidates running for governor, the primary should weed out the less competitive candidates and advance, whether 2, 3, or 4 or 5 to the general election. And that's a design question in how some of these reforms are structured. And what that does,
it's an important design question, which we'll get to. But
yes, I'm sure we'll get to the details there. But at a high level, what that does when you replace the bifurcated system of party primaries with an all-candidate primary, it gives every voter the ability to vote for whomever they want. And I think most Americans would like to have that in our election system today. And more importantly, it makes the general election matter again, because the primaries won't be determining the outcomes regardless of the district's partisan makeup.
Can you give us a little history? How is it that we ended up with a partisan primary system for nominating candidates to office? I mean, I assume at some point there weren't primaries at all. There were just party caucuses or meetings in back rooms, but somehow we ended up with a partisan system.
Well, when our framers, wrote our Constitution, designed our system of government and elections, they didn't contemplate party primaries because they didn't anticipate or desire parties to begin with. They feared them, in fact, for many of the reasons that we're seeing today in the factionalism that has come to really stymie our ability to govern ourselves. Nonetheless, when parties rose, they had their own systems of choosing their candidates, and that was the caucus and convention process. Now, 100 years, after the founding, voters got pretty upset that it was the party bosses sort of handpicking who the candidates were, and said, "No, we want to have a hand in that." Boss Tweed is probably one of the more famous party bosses of Tammany Hall and the New York City machine. And he famously once said, "I don't care who does the electing as long as I get to do the nominating," because They realized even back then that the whole power was in the primary. And so the corruption that bred led to, at the beginning of the 20th century, a reform called the direct primary, which said, no, all voters should be able to participate in these elections. And in 1904, Wisconsin was the first state to start to hold direct primaries. Within a decade, a majority of states started to hold them. And that's the system that we've had really since then. It served us well, I think, for most of the 20th century until our politics began to polarize as it has today, in which the old party bosses really have now become, replaced by the party bases. And so once again, it's time for us to look at the system and ask ourselves, is this the best we can do, or should we continue our proud American tradition of innovating and improving it?
So maybe tell us, where is your kind of reform, nonpartisan primaries in place? They do exist already. And what kind of results are you seeing in terms of the way they operate, what kind of governance they produce, that sort of thing?
Well, 5 states use a nonpartisan or all-candidate primary for either state and or federal office. That includes Nebraska, Louisiana, California, Washington, and most recently, Alaska. And they're all a little bit slightly different. But what is true is that to get elected to office, you don't have to contort your way through either party's primary en route. And that has served the voters. We see higher turnout in those nonpartisan primaries because voters actually get to decide who they want to represent them across party lines. And we also see governing incentives change with leaders elected from those states that are more pragmatic, and less politically extreme in their policymaking. There was one study done out of the University of Southern California that found among members of Congress, those elected from nonpartisan primaries are about 18 percentage points less extreme based on roll call voting and analysis of that than members elected under closed primaries. And that's simply because these systems are designed to ensure the majority of voters are in charge, not just the 8%. Then you can carry that forward, those incentives forward, to begin to understand policy and how policy is done in those states. In the book, I write about how Louisiana, for example, became the first and only Deep South state to pass Medicaid expansion through the legislature on a bipartisan basis. And I trace that back to the primary system and how more problem-solving candidates were elected.
Now, we mentioned before that there are different ways to do this. In California and Washington, they have a kind of a final 2. Those 2, the top 2, go to the general election. In Alaska, It's a top 4 that go to the general election. Can you tell us, have you noticed differences in how those different systems operate, and do you have a preference in terms of how we do it going forward?
So it is a design question to say if you have a single primary, how many candidates should advance regardless of party to the general election? The first systems that experimented with this in California and Washington said the top 2, and that was much better than the status quo of the old party primary system. But the limitation of top 2 is you can have general elections between 1D and 1R that are in a lopsided district and the general election doesn't matter. Or sometimes you can have 2 Rs or 2 Ds in a district. I think that is not a flaw, but part of the design of top 2, because those districts might only ever elect a Republican or Democrat, but you have voters feeling a bit dissatisfied with not having choice.
But sometimes you might have a blue district and the top 2 end up being 2 Rs. That because you have too many people running in the primary and it spreads the Democratic vote out. That kind of thing can happen with top 2.
It's a real edge case, but it does happen. In fact, it's happening in one of the statewide races in Washington potentially right now. It goes to the point, though, that no system is perfect. It's just which one is better in terms of trade-offs than others. So because of some of those limitations of top 2, a little over a decade ago, Fair Vote was the first organization to throw out an idea of combining a top 4 primary with ranked choice voting in the general election. Because if you advance more than 2 candidates, you would want one of those candidates to ensure that you win majority support. And you can either do that through a runoff or through an instant runoff, which is essentially what a ranked choice voting election produces. And there have been others, Catherine Gale and the Institute for Political Innovation, advocating for Final 5. But in reality, what the advantage is, if you have more than 2 candidates, is more choice for voters. Mm-hmm. And the fact that when you're running for office in a multi-candidate race, you can't just rely on your own party affiliation to get elected, to say, vote for me because I'm not the other team red or team blue. You actually have to run on something positive that you want to do and some issues that you believe in. And that's a good thing for democracy as well. So all else equal, we support Final 4 elections because it gives voters more and better choices in the general election.
Right. And so you said, and I think this is clearly right, that if you're going to have 4 people going into the general, you need to use ranked choice voting or instant runoff. Can you just explain briefly how that works or what that means?
Yes. So if you have 4 candidates on your ballot under the current plurality system, if you only pick one, it's conceivable that someone might win the election with, say, 30 or 40% of the vote. Maybe even someone that a majority of voters don't want to get elected.
Right.
And so there's a way of solving for that without asking voters to come back for a runoff between the top 2 finishers, which is just collect their backup preferences on election day, so that if no candidate earns majority support, you can use that information to conduct what we call an instant runoff, where the candidate with the least amount of votes is dropped and their supporters' number 2 choice gets reallocated. And that process repeats until someone emerges in this tabulation with majority support. And that's important because we want our leaders to represent a true majority of us. And that system is quite simple and straightforward because voters have the option of ranking if they want, or they can vote the old way if they want as well.
Right. So there's a lot in your book about the experience of the state of Alaska, which is using this Final 4, top 4 system with the ranked choice voting in the general, and has produced some rather interesting election outcomes that I think you would say certainly vindicate your faith in that system. Why don't you just talk about that for a little bit? What elections you would focus people on, and why you think they're an indication of the virtues of a nonpartisan Final 4 ranked choice system.
Yep. So Alaska passed the system through ballot initiative in 2020. It passed by just 1 percentage point, mind you. And then voters began to have the experience of using it. And what happened in 2022, I think, does demonstrate why Alaska is such a powerful proof of concept. When you look at the 3 statewide races that were on the ballot, a conservative Republican governor was reelected, a moderate Republican senator, Lisa Murkowski, was reelected, and a moderate Democrat in Mary Peltola won the open U.S. House race there. And so it showed that in a very independent-minded state like Alaska, This new system doesn't advantage one party or ideology. It simply gives more power to the people to decide in a nuanced way, who they want to represent them based on the individual candidates, and their issues. And so I think the diversity of election results is to the credit of this new system. Secondly, we also saw pretty interesting results in the state legislature, where as a result of this system, in both the state house and state senate, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are in charge today. There was bipartisan governing coalitions that came together in the legislature. Democrats, Republicans, Independents formed a majority coalition and said, we're going to put some divisive issues aside to focus on what's good for our state. And they did things like pass a budget in pretty record time and take on education reform and funding. And so it is a good example, I think, of how these systems can get our leaders back to focusing on what we want them to, which is the art and skill of governing.
So, but say I'm not a centrist, I'm a extreme right winger or extreme left winger. Should I be against this kind of reform because it's going to basically push everything toward the middle?
No, I mean, I use the example of, the governor's race where there's a very conservative governor there who is endorsed by Trump and vice versa, who wound up getting, reelected. And so the system is not about pushing things towards some elusive sense of moderation. It's really about upholding our principle of representation, that those who get elected and serve us ought to represent a true majority of us. And that's really the virtue of this system.
One of the things you hear is that it's basically a Democratic plot, that it gets people elected who wouldn't otherwise have gotten elected in a conservative state like Alaska. And certainly there were a lot of people very unhappy about the way that Sarah Palin wasn't elected to Congress and that sort of thing. Why isn't it something that the Democrats are using to get wins that they don't deserve?
Well, I don't think there's really evidence to support that. I mean,
I didn't make it up, right? They do. There were a few people who said it.
Yeah, of course. Yes, I mean, that's a common critique that both parties will use to oppose reform. They don't like giving more power to the people. They want to keep the power themselves. And so the best argument they can use is to tell their supporters, better watch out. These reforms are going to help elect the other party. And it's just not true. Alaska just had its second year of nonpartisan primaries under the system a couple days ago. And Mary Peltola, who's the incumbent moderate Democrat, won over 50% of the vote in the primary. All the top four candidates will proceed, but I just say that to show she is representing a true, majority of Alaskans, and we'll see what happens in the general election. But I mentioned before, a state like Louisiana is a system that doesn't have a party primary. They have a all-candidate general election. If no one gets 50%, there's a runoff. It's another way of achieving a similar outcome. And over the past couple decades, Democrats were, in control of Louisiana. The sea change in our politics commenced, and Republicans now, control supermajorities of the legislature and the governorship. So the system is not intended to try and flip a state in an unnatural way. It's intended to reflect where the voters are. And that can happen in a very red state or in a very blue state.
Another critique you hear, and I'd like you to respond to this, is that these kinds of reforms are going to end up hurting the ability of historically marginalized people, of voters of color, to get the kind of representation that they're able to get under the current partisan primary system. Can you explain what that critique really is, or at least comment on it, whether you think it makes any sense?
Well, I think we always have to be mindful that when we're changing anything to do with elections, what the impact is on all voters, including those that have historically been intentionally disenfranchised by our election system. I just don't think there's much weight behind claims that these reforms would negatively impact voters, especially communities of color. First, when you consider that there are 15 states where independent voters cannot even access the ballot, 9 of those states are Republican strongholds. And in those 9 states, 95% of Black voters are currently registered as either independent or as Democrat, which means that they cannot vote in the only elections that matter for governor or for Senate or for Congress or for their state legislature.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an affront to democracy to tell voters that they can't participate in the only elections of consequence. As you know, Paul, if you rewind the clock 100 years post passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, especially in southern states, there was all sorts of barriers put in place to keep African Americans from voting. The single most effective barrier that was erected was the so-called white primary. When the Democratic parties at the time, Republican parties, both of them said that you can only participate in our nominating process if you were white, because we're private organizations and those amendments don't apply to us. And that was actually upheld by the Supreme Court in the 1930s until 10 years later when it was overturned. And it's a stain on, I think, our democracy. But you tell me the difference in impact of the white primary that existed 100 years ago and the current closed party primaries in these 9 Republican states today, when 95% of Black voters can't participate. And that's why I think there's urgency in these reforms, because it will allow people to truly exercise their right to vote.
So let's talk sort of practical. How is it when you go out there and try to get these reforms done? How is it you convince enough partisan leaders to support you, or convince the people to support you against the wishes of their own representatives? How does this actually happen in practice?
Well, I think this reflects what the strategies of winning these reforms, because in about roughly half the states, there's a citizen initiative process where we simply, but it's not easy on the account of being simple, have to convince the voters to support these reforms, and they are broadly popular. When we did some polling and asked people, do you support the principle that every voter should be able to vote for any candidate in every taxpayer-funded election? And over 90% agreed, and that's really what these reforms are all about. Now, the actual practice of how do you write and qualify and defend an initiative even to get on the ballot is a tough chore, but that's historically how many of these tougher reforms have passed. Still, we need support from within the parties to sustain them or to prevent the legislatures from tampering with or overturning them. But when people exercise their vote and support these reforms in large numbers, I think the political establishment relents, because they realize this is actually popular, and they risk their own reelections if they start messing with the will of the people. But that only underscores how important it is that our victory isn't declared when we win a ballot initiative, but we have to be committed to the long haul of defense as well. Now,
Yes.
Passing these reforms to the legislatures is a whole nother strategy, and I think that's maybe more incremental, more long term.
We don't have any examples of that yet, do we?
Well, I would say that one interesting example that I write about is in California. Top 2 was adopted at the ballot, but it was referred to the ballot by the legislature. And the reason why it was referred to the ballot by the legislature was because there was one Republican in the legislature, Abel Maldonado, whose vote was needed to pass the state budget. And he said, the only way I'm going to vote for this budget, if you want it, is if you put this initiative on the ballot for the voters. And so it shows to me even how individual legislators, especially when they're in situations where they have a lot of political capital, can essentially help force this issue. And that's why I think we need to elect people who believe in these reforms as well.
So just what's the current state of play? Are there states where this is on the ballot right now and where you guys are fighting hard to get it passed?
Well, 2024 is an inflection point for this election reform movement, and particularly for primary reform. And I say that because, 3 states have adopted an all-candidate primary over the last really 15, 16 years, Washington, California, and then Alaska. So it took 15 years for the first 3 states. This year, there could be as many as 6 states that with initiatives on the ballot to move from party primaries to open all candidate primaries, which is really extraordinary, but also consistent with how we've seen change in our society, but even in our elections, which is it happens slowly and then all at once. It's not to say that all 6 initiatives will pass. I think it'll be a big deal if we end this election with more states having nonpartisan primaries than had it going in. So 1 or 2 more victories, I think, would be put a lot of wind in the sails of the movement. But the fact is, over 1.5 million voters have signed these petitions in 6 states to get it on the ballot. So there is more awareness, more understanding, more support than ever for elections that truly do serve the voters.
That's great. I mean, one of the things obviously that requires is the kind of money that can allow things like that to get heard, get understood, and eventually to get passed. Is there sufficient philanthropic support for this? You mentioned Catherine Gale and others. I'm just wondering, have people stepped up who have the resources to support this?
More now than ever before. United America, we relaunched our organization in 2019 as a philanthropic venture fund, which is a fancy way of saying to help attract and mobilize more financial support for this movement among philanthropy. And a couple of things I think have led us to be successful among our partners, which is that, one, the system keeps getting worse, both in terms of governing outcomes, but even the rise of independent voters, now over 50% according to Gallup. And so this problem of disenfranchisement is also getting worse. Second, our inability to solve major problems. Our debt is $35 trillion. Millions of people are entering the country legally, while we still have millions of people here without a real path to legal status, dreamers in particular. That problem keeps getting worse. And so there's more recognition that if we're going to solve any of these problems, we need a functional government. And so investment in election reform is really an investment upstream from every other societal challenge that philanthropy wants to solve. And then lastly, there's a strong proof of concept. I think the fact that Alaska won and produced the results it has gave confidence to philanthropists that this is possible to achieve and is impactful to achieve elsewhere too.
And it's been successfully defended. We at CLC were happy to be involved in that. It's been nice to see that the reform survived a pretty intense challenge.
Yeah.
Tell me about Maine. That's also talked about. Is that just a ranked choice state, or do they also have the nonpartisan primaries there?
They just have ranked choice, although getting ranked choice there is a very big deal, and I think helped really catalyze the whole modern election reform movement, because that was stunning insofar as the voters got it onto the ballot. Maine in 2016 became the first state to adopt ranked choice voting statewide. And then the legislature did what legislatures tend to do, which is to try and find every way to continue to fight it. And they effectively, delayed it. And so the citizens said, they went back to the ballot in 2018 with something called a people's veto to undo what the legislature did. And they won again. And then ever since then, Maine has been using this ranked choice system. It was
only for federal offices, right? Because the Maine Constitution doesn't allow it to be used for state offices. But
that's right. I believe
Congress, Senate, President,
and I believe state legislature, not the statewide offices. And so there's more work to be done there, including on the primary reform. But even Maine is a good example of sort of the steps you can take forward. They passed ranked choice voting a couple of years ago. The legislature also passed in a bipartisan way semi-open primaries, which is a way of allowing independent voters in that state to participate, which they did for the first time, I believe, just this year in the primaries. And so Maine has led the way, Alaska's led the way, and I think other states are now inclined to follow.
They have a long tradition of very strong independent candidates in Maine, which it was one of the reasons why ranked choice voting made sense. You had a lot of people winning office with 33% of the vote for governor, that kind of stuff.
That's right.
But it's been nice to see, and that too got a constitutional challenge after it changed the outcome of the House race a couple of years ago in one of the two House districts in Maine. So what's your prognosis for all of this? Do you think that in 5 or 10 years you will have accomplished a really transformative change in the way the country operates its democracy?
I sure hope. Personally, I've been at this for about a decade, finding, where's the greatest leverage? How do you move the ball forward?
Running for Congress was kind of part of the same effort, I suppose.
Right. All about trying to find the biggest way to make a difference. And I have never been more optimistic about, this movement and the new organizations, the new leaders in it, groups like Veterans for All Voters, for example, and more veterans, half of whom are independent, stepping forward to demand a right to vote and cast a meaningful ballot. And the progress that we're making in the courts, in the legislatures, at the ballot. Now, of course, and other movements have experienced this. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back because of the political opposition that may emerge to this. Again, if there's one issue that is especially hard to take on in our country, it is going right to the power structure of how power is won and kept. And so I'm confident, though, because the people are the ultimate stewards of our democracy, and in history have stood up and made change, and that's exactly what we're doing again today. One other part that I'm excited about is, to date, the movement has largely been focused on state legislative and ballot initiatives, but just 2 weeks ago, there was a federal bill introduced in Congress on a bipartisan basis called the Let America Vote Act. And what this bill would do is mandate, under the elections clause of our Constitution, that every voter be able to vote in every taxpayer-funded election. And so it would effectively abolish closed primaries in the 15 states where independents can't vote. And those states would be free to experiment with whatever kind of solution they wanted, whether it was simply allowing those voters to participate, or maybe going to an Louisiana system or an Alaska system. And that bill might not pass this year, but it's certainly something to begin organizing around, and gives a glimmer of hope for what national and federal change can look like down the road as well.
One of the reforms that is a big part of our work at CLC, in addition to obviously supporting what you guys are doing, is independent redistricting commissions, nonpartisan independent redistricting commissions, to try to get the gerrymandering out of the districts. And we've run into a barrier which you may very well run into soon, which is, it's one thing to get things passed in that group of Western states where you can get things on the ballot with signatures alone, and it's much tougher where you have to get it through the legislature in 2 successive legislative years and that sort of stuff. So certainly the eastern half of the country, which is more the latter, is a tougher nut to crack when it comes to these reforms that essentially disempower politicians and give power to people.
It's harder, certainly, but not impossible. And as you know from the experience of Virginia passing the independent redistricting commission, they had to go through the legislature between 2 successive sessions, but there was an election in between, and so at in one of those times, Republicans were against it and Democrats were for it. Then there was a bit of change in leadership, and Democrats wound up opposed and Republicans for. But it was ultimately successful, and one of the reasons why was because there was a real effort in supporting the brave legislators who stood up to their party to do the right thing, and holding those accountable who didn't and who flip-flopped or opposed. And we were involved in some of those legislative races, and so I think it's an important takeaway, which is, if we're going to be successful in the legislature, we need to be a special interest for the public interest and get involved in these elections to show that the voters are paying attention and are going to reward folks that stand up for what's right for voters.
It was helpful there that neither party was sure who was going to be in charge in the next few years, and so enough on both sides said better a fair system than one where we're completely shut out of the process of drawing the districts.
That's right.
That's the Virginia story. Maybe we can extend that in the area of nonpartisan primaries to other states, even ones that require the legislature to sign on. This would be a good time, I think, Nick, to go to the Q&A portion of our discussion and see if we have any questions from our audience. And look, here we do. Michael asks this question: what could others do to help support the defense of this, meaning the nonpartisan program in Alaska?
Great question. So in addition to the 6 states that are pursuing primary reform on the ballot, and a couple states that are looking at ranked choice voting and redistricting as well, I think 9 states plus in total, there are a couple states we're actually on defense. That defense could include a state like North Dakota, which is trying to make the initiative process itself harder in the future, or a state like Arizona, which is trying to constitutionally ban these reforms that we're talking about, although there's also an offensive initiative there. But most importantly, Alaska. Alaska, the folks who lost under the new system because they did not win true majority support, are trying to repeal the system. They tried to repeal it in the legislature in 2023, and our coalition was successful in defending it. Now they're trying to repeal it at the ballot in 2024. There's a group called Alaskans for Better Elections, as well as other partner organizations in state that would benefit from the support of anyone on this call, whether that's volunteer help and reaching out to voters in that state, contributions as well. But we're 70 plus days out from the election, and now's the time to step forward. Alaska is a critical must win, for the movement to protect the proof of concept that many other states are following.
Great, thanks for that. Is there another question? If not, I can come up with a couple more of my own. Looks like we are not getting another one flashed up here. So maybe let me ask you this question. Would it be better if we simplified the process and all agreed in the reform community on one version of this? Is it confusing to voters, and is it in some ways kind of nullifying our impact that there are so many different ways to do this and different states are going in different directions?
I think it's a feature, not a bug, that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I think every state is different, and so different systems may have a different impact on their state, or voters may support different kinds of policies. I think the challenge is more so that we have a real disparate way in which to describe the work that we're doing, and so some of our efforts is around how to create some more consistent messaging and branding, around this movement, so that people know what we're talking about, and not to focus just on the nuances of the policy difference, when at the end of the day, the common denominator is the same across many of these states. United America has often talked about it in terms of two key principles. One I mentioned before, where voters have the freedom to vote for whomever they want in every election. And the second is whoever wins should get majority support. That's true among all the different states we've been talking about with different versions of this system. And so I think more important than universal policy is maybe just some more universal messaging on it.
Have you found the need for a kind of a responsive messaging too, responding to the argument that each party ought to be able to have their own process to pick their own candidate, and you shouldn't be trying to mix everything together just to dilute the ability of each party to pick their ideal candidate?
You're saying that that's a common sort of critique of these?
Yeah, and I would think that you need to have in the back pocket a responsive message that says, yeah, that's a false narrative.
I do think that is one concern people have, which is my party should be able to choose its leader without needing to open up that process to folks that don't wear our same uniform. And again, as a private organization, I don't disagree. And so more power to the Republican or Democratic Party in any state that wants to facilitate its own process for recruiting and supporting and endorsing its own candidate. My whole argument is that should be disentangled from the process of running an election, which all voters should have a right to participate in, that we're funding. And so it's really about accepting the premise of that critique, but implementing the impact of it in a different way.
Fair enough. Let's see if there's another question from the audience. I'm told there is. Nick, what do you think of a state constitutional convention as a vehicle to pursue United America's democratic reform agenda? State constitutional convention, not national constitutional convention, I hope.
It really has not come up in a very tangible way yet in our experience of using a state constitutional convention to advance these reforms, although I don't see why not, because
it has happened in some states in recent memory. New Jersey rewrote their entire election system in the 60s and stuff.
And those may present opportunities for reformers to advance some of these ideas, because in essence what several of these ballot measures will do is to make constitutional amendments, right, to state constitutions. And so I do think where those opportunities exist, we should be thoughtful about that. The other prong, and you know more about this, Paul, than I, is a litigation strategy. I think the primary reform movement has been rather light and needs to do a lot more on that. Other movements have been successful, environmental, civil rights, others that can really use the legal process to establish these rights. The nonpartisan all-candidate primary system has been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, which is great, but we haven't made as much traction opposing closed primaries. And I do think as more and more voters leave both parties, it becomes untenable to defend a publicly funded, government-run system in the way that they exist today. And
I would start in state constitutional arguments for a while. It seems like the federal courts are not the place to go to try to win that.
Right. And that's sort of my point. I think there's a lot more we can do to look at those state constitutions and see where there may be opportunities.
I think that we have time for another question if there's one left up there, Emma. I'm working in Nevada. Open primary and top 5 ranked choice. I'm going to be sharing this video widely. Thank you. Any tips for winning in November?
Well, thank you for your work in Nevada. It's one of the states where, I'm not even sure there is another state, Paul, but it passed on the ballot in 2022, and to amend the state's constitution, it has to pass again this year. It won with 53% support last time.
But it didn't have to go through the legislature. It just had to pass a vote of the people twice in 2 successive elections. Right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And
that's hard enough.
You're right. And it's a big deal for Nevada because there are 700,000 plus independent voters there that can't participate in these elections. That would change when this measure, hopefully, knock on wood, passes again in November. I think one of the pieces of advice that we have to campaigns is really focus on the value of what these reforms represent. And it's about fairness and equal access to the ballot for both voters and for candidates. And it's about giving more power to voters rather than the political insiders. And ultimately, it's about trying to improve governance to solve problems. I think there's a tendency to want to over-explain how these things work or oversell the potential benefits. And I think if we stick to the basics of the values that we espouse and the impact that we want to have, we'll be successful in November.
So Nevada is an example, and you said there are others of these kinds of ballot measures on the ballot in a presidential election year in November. Is that the ideal time to have these things on the ballot because you get a much broader turnout of people who are less, sort of party insider types?
Yes is the short answer, although it becomes more expensive in presidential years in the same way, especially in a battleground state like Nevada. But the number one predictor of someone's support for election reform is not their party affiliation or their ideology, it's age. Young people are much more open to changing a system that they quite evidently have seen not work so well. And older voters may be more tied to the way that we've done it for a long time. And in a presidential year with a younger electorate, I think many of these initiatives will see a benefit from that.
Interesting. I think we could squeeze in one more audience question if we want to put it up, Emma. In Louisiana, we've recently had statewide office primaries closed. The legislature did not want to do that. Their own offices are closed. Primaries better or worse at different levels. So why don't you explain what that means and then answer it if you can there.
Sure, yeah. I mentioned Louisiana earlier. Since the mid-1970s, Louisiana has had an open election system, which means that they don't essentially have a primary process. They have a general election. All the candidates are on the ballot, and if no one wins majority, there is a runoff. The governor that was just elected in 2022 came into office in 23 and decided that him winning his election and Republicans getting supermajorities wasn't enough, and they needed to close the primaries. And in some ways, I believe this was a direct response of a retribution campaign against Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, who was one of the 7 U.S. senators to vote to convict Trump in his impeachment trial, in part reflecting that he perhaps had a little bit more political latitude than Republicans in other states who faced party primaries. So in any case, the governor wanted to close all the primaries. United America and our partners fought hard against that, as did the voters of Louisiana. And it got whittled down to just a semi-open primary and just for federal office. So if that law takes effect in 2026, it will only impact the federal races, and independents can choose which party, but Democrats won't be able to vote in the Republican primary.
Well, that's still pretty open. I mean, compared to a lot of states, as you noted earlier.
Yeah, it could be worse. And to the question posed, the relative impact of state or federal, we're focused on federal because it's a pathway of impacting the function of Congress. And our belief is that if we can win these reforms in a half dozen more states by 2026, that's 12 more U.S. senators who are free to lead and can form a fulcrum in the Senate of problem solvers. However, 60% of members of Congress get there from their state legislatures. And so over the long term, having close primaries at the state level really does impact the kind of pipeline of leaders that may run for higher office.
Well, let me just offer you the opportunity, Nick. I think this has been really interesting and informative, and I've learned a lot. An opportunity to give us some closing thoughts about this problem in your book and where you see this all going.
Well, closing thoughts is we can't be daunted by this challenge. Certainly our predecessors weren't when we faced opportunities or challenges to expand the franchise or to advance things like the direct election of the Senate or the secret ballot. I mean, when you really think about how much our election system's evolved since the founding, what we're talking about is not radical here. It's just actually a continuation of a very important American tradition. And it's on us because the parties aren't going to champion these reforms, the people will. So it's groups like CLC, it's folks like all of you that will help make it happen. And this is the year. We have many opportunities on the ballot. We're going to head into legislative session next year with even more opportunities. States like New Mexico and Pennsylvania with bipartisan bills to open their primaries. So get involved. If you want to learn more about our various partner organizations, head to uniteamerica.org. And just want to thank CLC for being a very great partner in hosting this conversation.
Well, and thanks, Nick, for all you do. It's really great, and I think I'm hoping you're going to have great success with this in 2024.
Well, thank you, Paul.
To all of you out there, if you have any additional questions or you'd like more information, please email us at info@campaignlegal.org. And thank you to Nick for speaking to us and thank you to all of you for joining us today. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.